we've got a major update on the story of Air Force soldier Aaron Bushnell, who set himself on fire in protest of Israel. Just hours before his self-immolation, Bushnell claimed that he had secret knowledge of American troops fighting in Hamas tunnels under Gaza. Now, per the New York Post, the 25-year-old airman claimed he had, quote, top secret clearance for military intelligence data in the call to his friends on Saturday night. Now, his friends claimed, quote, he told me on Saturday that we have troops in those tunnels, that it's U.S. soldiers participating in the killings. Quote, he told me that we had troops on the ground that were there and were there killing large numbers of Palestinians. There's just too many things I don't know, but I can tell you that the tone of his voice just had something in it that told me he was scared. Neither the Air Force nor the White House has commented on this story.
That said, the White House has repeatedly said it doesn't plan on sending U.S. forces to Gaza, though American special forces have been seen on the ground in Israel since the October 7th attacks. There has also been new scrutiny because of this news of a picture that was posted to the White House Instagram account and then deleted that seemed to show covert Delta Force teams shaking hands with Joe Biden, and that the Post also covered at the time saying that it seems to be outing these special operators that might be working on the ground, hence the choice to ultimately delete it. So this is an interesting issue, in part because troops on the ground has been, in a lot of different conflicts, a red line for Americans, to the extent that there is some support for the idea of Israel defending itself and engaging militarily in Gaza, and the U.S. supporting financially those efforts. The idea of committing American troops to those efforts and potentially having American soldiers die as a consequence of those efforts is a very different ballgame.
Yes, of course, we would need, significant additional corroboration to suggest such a thing is going on. Bushnell has died, so this is apparently something he told friends, so we're hearing it from them. So it should absolutely be investigated because it is outrageous if, as you said, American ground forces are involved in a conflict, something that, yes, even as many Americans do support our allies overseas, are very clear about not wanting U.S. soldiers put in harm's way. That's often something that divides the people from our elected leadership in Washington in both parties, who is so callous about wasting American lives. So certainly outrageous, but I think needs further investigation.
Yeah, his friend went on to say that he understands that Bushnell had security clearance for 4 years now. He said, quote, it's the only time that he has ever, as far as I know, broke protocol and gave out information that he shouldn't have. And again, we read that he said he was frightened. It's a really tough situation. It's been fascinating to watch the different responses to the self-immolation. For so many people, it does seem to have kind of reinvigorated interest in focusing on the seriousness and the gravity of the harms that are befalling people in the region. I do think there's something about protests and protesters that can be easily waved away by kind of corporate media as unserious young people who are, hashtag activists and who don't really know what life is like and aren't really willing to put anything on the line. But when you have someone who is a member of the Air Force, who is serving in the military, who is directly connected to what's been going on, who sees himself as personally implicated through his own profession, who has committed himself to serving the country, and who is also committed to ending his life over what he perceives to be an unconscionable humanitarian ordeal, it does shift the conversation into a realm of seriousness that is very difficult to ignore.
If you say so. I continue to be just utterly horrified by this course of action and totally against suicide, particularly in such a violent way. I can't speak to his mental state. I think it's wrong to speculate. Perhaps he was exactly as presented, has sincere ideological opposition to what's going on. I certainly think anyone who is involved in the military and does not approve of the actions of the U.S. military should decline to follow those orders. Should get out, or should not follow illegal or immoral or unconstitutional orders. I absolutely support that. I was reading an interesting Atlantic article by Graham Wood about the history of self-immolation as a protest tactic, and he draws on some sociological research on the subject, and he admits that you can certainly point to examples, including Vietnam-related examples, where this protest act did seem to stir public opinion in the direction of the person who did self-immolation wanted. He also says there are other examples which are less well-known that you would not find a lot of basis for the idea that it influenced public opinion, including in China. He points to members of the Falun Gong religious sect who engaged in this practice in 2001, and actually including the self-immolation of a 12-year-old girl whose death was on TV like days and days and weeks, and actually helped move the Chinese population against the religious sect because they were seen as actually so extreme, and people started to believe what the Chinese government was saying about them.
That doesn't seem to be what's happening here, since already polls suggest that there's a lot of sympathy for the innocent people in Gaza. I mean, how do you defend a government knowing that an area that it has occupied for generations is undergoing a famine, and then bombing and disabling the aid trucks that are supposed to be delivering much-needed food to the area? I mean, how do you defend that?
I think regardless of one's views on that, though, if I agreed with all that, I still wouldn't take the position that the answer to this is for people to set themselves on fire. It's
well, that's the problem. So many folks feel like every form of
Horrific.
protest is tone police.
I didn't say every form of protest.
I said some people think
Sure.
that every form of protest is tone policed. You're not allowed to block traffic. You're not allowed to protest at a museum. You're not allowed to splash soup on a painting, even if it causes no harm whatsoever to a painting. You're not allowed to be an artist who buys art with your own money and says you're going to destroy the art if a ceasefire doesn't happen. You're not allowed to protest outside of a congressperson's home because that is a kind of violence and threatening to them. You're not allowed to protest outside of the White House without police tackling you and being told that you did a vandalism because the red paint that you put on your hand is also on the fencing around that building. Yeah, you're not allowed to do boycott, divest, and sanction without being told you're literally breaking law in some places in America and having your livelihood stripped away from you. So at a certain point, it becomes clear that the problem, to many, that the problem isn't protest itself, but what we're protesting, and the fact that powerful establishment forces don't want you to have the ability to change minds and make real change. And I think that is what is so, humbling about the commitment that Aaron Bushnell made here. Is that it was such a complete commitment to something that, of course, he knows is going to be read in a bunch of different ways and interpreted in a bunch of different ways by different people. But by live streaming it, at very least, he took some control over his story. He made it so that it couldn't be buried as easily as the previous self-immolation that happened at the end of last year. And it has definitely sparked a national conversation that feels meaningful and important to many people.
I would not use the word you shouldn't be allowed to. Many of those tactics you're describing are things I've criticized while still saying you should enjoy your First Amendment rights to do them. I mean, not to deface other people's property. I don't think suicide should be illegal. You should be allowed to do it. I mean, the idea of making it illegal is actually kind of self-defeating. You can't prosecute someone who kills themselves. I think it is something that should be absolutely culturally stigmatized, delegitimized, opposed thoughtfully by people. And I would never want to inject the idea into the culture that an act of suicide is some kind of act of taking control of one's life or circumstances or doing something positive for the discourse in this country. It just seems like a violent and destructive act.
Physician-assisted kind of palliative suicide, when people choose because they have a terminal disease and their quality of life has declined and they choose to commit suicide. You think that's immoral and should be discouraged, and people should just have to live out the end of their life care without being able to have that kind of autonomy over their decision making? Would you put that in the same category as people who are dealing with mental health issues and the like?
I think, again, they should have the right to do it. I don't support making it illegal. I think the example of someone who is in extreme pain or advanced disease, I think that is a much different choice than what we're talking about here. On the mental health part, I certainly fear, and we see this in Canada, we hear reports of this, of government-encouraged assisted suicide for people with minor and treatable cases of depression or some other psychological illness. And I very much worry about that we're going down a path of, oh, something is not right with you, the answer is suicide.
So this is my point, and I think it's an important libertarian one.
Well, from a libertarian, it should be permitted, absolutely permitted.
It is obviously a very different thing that Aaron Bushnell did than what someone in the midst of a mental health crisis, because they feel bad about their lives and they're depressed and might do. And it's a very different. Both of those things are very different from what someone who has a terminal disease and is in palliative care and in a lot of pain might do. And so to just say suicide is wrong as a broad brush, I think is frankly, it's misrepresenting the nuances of this conversation in a way that I think serves to undermine the political valence and political importance of what people who have self-immolated over history have done and the effect that it's had on changing the course of history, sometimes in positive ways.
All right, more Rising right after this.